Okay, so we need to learn how to mark trig graphs. And there's two different ways to do it. You probably learned method 2 last year in Algebra 2. There's another way if that's rough for you, and I'll talk about that way first. But if you're comfortable with the second method, just by all means go with the second method. So when you have a graph, you're going to have to find the starting point, which we'll get into later. But you'll have a starting point, and you will have a period. So for our first example here, you can see we have a starting point. Don't worry about those. We'll be finding those in a second. And you'll be given a period. To get the rest of the points, because you should have 5 points for every trig graph that you do, you can take the starting point plus 1/4 times the period, starting point plus 1/2 times the period, starting point plus 3/4 times the period, and then the starting point plus the period. That is one way to get all 5 of your points. The other way, which is the way that you probably have learned before, is you take your starting point. That's point 1. Your ending point is your starting point plus your period. That's the last point. Then your midpoint is you take your starting point and your end point and divide by 2, and that'll get you your midpoint. Your 1/4 point, so that point would be your starting point and your midpoint, divide by 2, and you'll get that one. So you're kind of taking the average. And then again, you would get your 3/4 point by taking your starting point plus your midpoint plus your end point and then dividing that by 2. So what would that look like? Well, here I have both methods worked out. So you would take your starting point plus 1/4 times your period. And you can go through and you can do the math, get common denominators. That'll be 4 pi over 12, which is pi over 3. You do the same thing, pi over 4 plus 1/2 times your period. So your starting point plus 1/2 times your period. You can get a common denominator, and that would work that way. You also then would do 3/4, starting point plus 3/4 times your period, and then starting point plus your period, which gets you your final points. That at least gets you your points in order. Method 2, like I said, is the way that more of you are comfortable with. You take your starting point plus your period, that gets you your end point. Take your starting point plus your end point, divide by 2, and that would get you your midpoint. Your starting point plus your midpoint, divide by 2, that would get your 1/4 point, and then your your midpoint plus your end point, divide by 2, and that would get you your 3/4 point. Now, if you're concerned about all these fractions, you can do this on a calculator. You just have to ignore the pi's. So, for example, and I see we have a glare, so I'm going to move over here. So for method 2, to get your end point, you would do your starting point, ignore the pi, so 1/4 plus your period, ignoring the pi, divide by 2, and then do math frac. And that is 7/24, which is not what I have there. What did I do wrong? 1/4 and 1/3. Oh, I divided it by 2. I did the second part. See, this is what happens. So actually, we only wanted to do 1/4 plus 1/3 math frac. So that's 7/12. That's your endpoint. Now, if I wanted to get the second one, so I would take, to get your midpoint, you would take your endpoint plus your starting point. So starting point plus your endpoint. So there was my endpoint plus my starting point. Divide by 2. Math frac. 5 pi over 12, and you can continue to do that for the rest of those. So look at your worksheet and try the next one. So if you look at your worksheet, you have a starting point and you have a period. Pick which way you want to do, so either add them together and keep taking averages, or do 1/4 times the period, 1/2 times the period, 3/4 times the period, and the whole period, and get all 5 points. So pause the video now and see what you can do. Okay, after you paused your video, this is what you should have gotten. And I did method 1 here. You could do whichever method you want. And these are the answers you should have gotten. I do want to point out that some of you might see a pattern as you're going, and we're actually just moving up every step by 9 pi over 24. So this is 8 pi over 24, plus 9 pi over 24 is 17 pi over 24, plus another 9 pi over 4 is 26 pi over 24, plus another 9 pi over 4 is 35 pi over 24, and obviously I'm reducing at some of these. And then add another 9 pi is 44 pi over 24. Okay, let's look at another type of problem. So for some of these, you're going to have to find the period. And to find the period, you would just take your end point minus your start point, because the period is from how long does it take to get from beginning to end. And just like before, we can go through and we can do this in our calculator. 3 divided by 4, oops. 3 divided by 4 minus, okay, and some of you are wary about this, so I'm going to put it in just like you see it, but minus the negatives plus the positive. 1 divided by 2. Math, frac, is 5 pi over 4, and that's our period. This one I'm going to do method 2. So I'm going to take our start point plus our end point, or excuse me, our start point plus our end point, divide by 2, and that is going to get you your midpoint. So don't forget to divide by 2, divide by 2. To get your 1/4 point, you're going to do this part plus this part divided by 2. That's going to get us negative 3 pi over 16. And notice I had to kind of move that line. It wasn't in the right place. And then 3 pi over 4, or the 3/4 point is pi over 8. So pi over 8 plus 3 pi over 4. Add them together, divide by 2. And that's going to be 7 pi over 16. Okay, pause the video now and see if you can get the last 3. Okay, here's the next one. No matter which way you did it, you should have gotten these answers. So go back and check to see where you went wrong. So if you do the averaging method, if you've gotten this one wrong, you added the starting point and the period together incorrectly. If your midpoint is wrong, then you forgot to divide by 2 when you added those together, etc. The next one, these are the answers you should have gotten. Again, you can do this in your calculator. And finally, so hopefully we have a good idea now on how to mark our trig graphs.